Officer Justin Santana pointed his service weapon directly at Jordan Ellis's head, while the paramedic's hands were deep inside a dying man's chest, performing emergency compressions that were the only thing keeping blood flowing to a father's brain. "Step away from the vehicle now," Santana barked, his finger hovering over the trigger as Jordan counted the seconds, 28, 29, 30, knowing that each moment of interrupted CPR pushed Robert Chen deeper toward a place no medical skill could retrieve him from. The ambulance lights painted red streaks across Santana's face, but his eyes stayed cold, locked on a black man in uniform who refused to let a patient die just because a badge demanded submission to authority over the preservation of human life. What state are you from? Have you ever seen someone in uniform treat another person's life like it was worth less than their own ego? When a badge becomes more important than breathing, who decides what justice really means? The call had come in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night that started like any other for Jordan Ellis. 23 years of emergency medicine had taught him that death didn't follow schedules, didn't respect sleep patterns, and certainly didn't care that he'd already worked a 14-hour shift and was looking forward to seeing his daughter's soccer game the next morning. When dispatch crackled through his radio with gunshot wound, Miller's Grocery, 1947 Riverside Drive, multiple units responding, Jordan was already reaching for his keys before the transmission ended. Jordan had been a paramedic longer than some of his colleagues had been alive. He'd started when ambulances were still running on hope and basic equipment, back when the job was about getting people to hospitals fast, rather than bringing the hospital to them. Over the years, he'd watched emergency medicine evolve into something approaching science fiction. Medications that could restart hearts, equipment that could monitor brain activity in real time, procedures that could keep someone alive long enough for miracles to happen. But at its core, the job remained exactly what it had always been, standing between a person and the thing that wanted to kill them. Miller's Grocery sat at the intersection of Riverside Drive and Martin Luther King Boulevard, in a neighborhood that had seen better decades but still maintained the kind of community spirit that kept local businesses alive through economic downturns and urban renewal projects that never quite renewed anything. Jordan knew the area well. He'd responded to calls here before, mostly minor incidents, domestic disputes that got out of hand, occasional overdoses, the usual urban emergencies that happened when people got too tired, too broke, or too desperate to make good decisions. But tonight felt different from the moment Jordan turned onto Riverside Drive. Police cars lined the street like a military convoy, their red and blue lights creating a disco of law enforcement that painted every building, every face, every piece of broken glass in alternating colors of authority. Jordan counted 6 squad cars, which was unusual for a single shooting, especially in this neighborhood where police response was typically measured in delayed minutes rather than overwhelming presence. Jordan parked his ambulance behind the police perimeter and grabbed his medical kit, the weight of it familiar in his hands like a carpenter's hammer or a painter's brush. 23 years of carrying the same basic tools: defibrillator, oxygen tank, IV supplies, trauma bandages, medications that could mean the difference between someone going home or someone getting a funeral. He'd upgraded the equipment over the years, replaced worn-out components, learned to use new technology, but the fundamental mission remained unchanged. As Jordan approached the scene, he could see a crowd of bystanders pressed against the police tape, their faces illuminated by the strobing emergency lights. Some were holding phones, recording whatever was happening beyond the barrier. Others were talking in hushed voices, sharing theories about what they'd heard, what they'd seen, what they thought was going on. Jordan had learned long ago not to trust eyewitness accounts. People saw what they expected to see, heard what they were prepared to hear, and remembered details that supported whatever story made sense to them afterward. But the blood was real. Jordan could see it from 20 feet away. A dark stain spreading across the concrete in front of Miller's Grocery. Too much blood for a minor injury. Too fresh for an old incident. Someone was hurt badly, and from the way the police officers were clustered around something on the ground, Jordan knew he was looking at the kind of call that would either end with a life saved or a family destroyed. "Paramedic coming through," Jordan announced as he approached the police line, holding up his medical kit so the officers could see his credentials. Most cops knew to clear a path for emergency medical personnel, understood that time was usually the enemy in these situations, that every second of delay could mean the difference between recovery and permanence. Officer Janet Rodriguez, whom Jordan had worked with on previous calls, lifted the police tape to let him through. "Gunshot wound to the chest," she said quickly, her voice carrying the kind of professional urgency that meant the situation was serious. "Victim is conscious but losing blood fast. Shooter fled the scene. We're still looking for him." Jordan nodded and moved toward the center of the activity, where he could see a man lying on his back, surrounded by police officers who were trying to provide first aid with the kind of basic training that was better than nothing, but not nearly enough for this kind of injury. The victim was Asian, middle-aged, wearing a simple button-down shirt that was now soaked in blood from a wound Jordan could see was in the upper left quadrant of his chest, probably close to the heart, definitely close to major blood vessels. "Sir, I'm Jordan Ellis. I'm a paramedic," Jordan said as he knelt beside the man, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos around him. "What's your name?" "Robert," the man whispered, his voice weak but clear. "Robert Chen. My family, are they safe?" Jordan looked up and saw a woman and 2 children being held back by police officers about 30 feet away, their faces twisted with fear and confusion. "They're safe," Jordan told Robert, placing his hand on the man's shoulder. "Right now, I need you to focus on breathing for me. Can you do that?" Robert nodded, his eyes locking onto Jordan's face with the kind of desperate trust that people only showed when they understood they were dying and needed someone else to fight for their life. Jordan had seen that look thousands of times, and it never got easier, never became routine, never stopped feeling like someone was handing him their entire future and asking him not to drop it. Jordan quickly assessed the wound, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this exact procedure hundreds of times. The bullet had entered Robert's chest about 3 inches below his left collarbone, probably nicking the subclavian artery based on the bleeding pattern and the victim's blood pressure, which Jordan could tell was dropping fast just from looking at Robert's skin color and the way his breathing was becoming more labored. "I need to get some pressure on this wound and start an IV," Jordan said to the nearest police officer. "Can you help me get him into a better position?" That's when Jordan noticed Officer Justin Santana for the first time. Santana was standing about 10 feet away from the scene, not helping with crowd control, not assisting with the first aid, just watching Jordan work with an expression that seemed less concerned with the dying man and more focused on the black paramedic who was trying to save him. There was something in Santana's posture, something in the way he was holding his hands near his service weapon that made Jordan's instincts start sending warning signals. But Jordan didn't have time for instincts. Robert Chen was bleeding out on a sidewalk, and Jordan had maybe 5 minutes to get him stabilized before blood loss became irreversible. He opened his medical kit and began assembling the equipment he needed: trauma bandages, IV catheter, saline solution, pressure bandages, all the tools that modern emergency medicine provided to fight against gunshot wounds and keep people alive long enough to get them to an operating room. "Robert, I'm going to need to apply some pressure to your chest," Jordan explained as he worked. "It's going to hurt, but it's going to slow the bleeding so we can get you to the hospital." Robert nodded weakly, his skin now noticeably paler than it had been 2 minutes earlier. Jordan could see that they were running out of time, that Robert's body was starting to show the signs of shock that meant his cardiovascular system was beginning to fail. Jordan pressed a trauma bandage against the entry wound and began applying pressure, feeling the warm blood seeping through the fabric as he worked to compress the damaged blood vessels. "Sir, step away from the victim," came a voice from behind Jordan. Jordan didn't look up from his work. Police officers sometimes got nervous around medical procedures, especially when there was a lot of blood involved. But Jordan had learned that the best way to handle their concerns was to keep working and explain what he was doing as he did it. "I'm a paramedic," Jordan said, his hands never stopping their work on Robert's chest. "I'm trying to stop the bleeding so we can transport him to the hospital." I said step away from the victim. This time Jordan looked up and saw Officer Justin Santana standing directly above him, his hand resting on his service weapon. There was something in Santana's eyes that Jordan had seen before, usually in people who had already decided that someone was guilty of something before they'd bothered to figure out what crime might have been committed. "Officer, this man is bleeding out," Jordan said, his voice calm but firm. "I need to get him stabilized for transport." "You need to step away from him right now," Santana replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance without question or explanation. Jordan felt his heart rate increase, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that he was dealing with a police officer who either didn't understand emergency medical procedures or didn't care about them. Either way, Robert Chen was still bleeding, and Jordan wasn't going to let a confused cop prevent him from doing his job. "Officer, I'm going to continue treating this patient," Jordan said, turning his attention back to Robert's chest wound. "If you have questions about my credentials, you can check with dispatch or speak to your supervisor." That's when Jordan heard the distinctive sound of a service weapon being drawn from its holster. Jordan had heard that sound before, usually on television or in movies, but occasionally in real life, during the handful of times his job had brought him into contact with armed suspects or dangerous situations. But he had never heard it directed at him, had never been on the receiving end of that particular metallic click that meant someone was preparing to use deadly force. Jordan's hands stopped moving for exactly 1 second as the reality of the situation penetrated his consciousness. Then his training took over, the part of his mind that had been developed through years of emergency medicine, the part that knew how to function under pressure and make life or death decisions when there wasn't time to think about consequences. Jordan resumed applying pressure to Robert Chen's chest wound. "I said step away from him." Santana's voice was now directly behind Jordan's head, close enough that Jordan could feel the officer's breath on his neck. Jordan didn't look up. He could see that Robert's breathing was becoming more shallow, that his pulse was getting weaker, that they were rapidly approaching the point where no amount of medical intervention would be able to bring him back. Jordan had seen people die from this exact type of injury, had watched families destroyed by gunshot wounds that could have been survivable if treatment had been provided quickly enough. "Sir, if you don't move away from that man, I'm going to shoot you." Jordan felt the cold metal of Santana's gun barrel press against the back of his head, but his hands continued their work on Robert's chest. 23 years of emergency medicine had taught Jordan that there were moments when everything else became secondary to the simple obligation to preserve human life. When personal safety, professional protocols, and even legal consequences had to be weighed against the immediate need to prevent someone from dying. This was one of those moments. "Officer," Jordan said quietly, his voice steady, despite the weapon pressed against his skull. "This man is going to die if I stop what I'm doing. I need about 30 more seconds to get the bleeding controlled. You need to move right now." Jordan could feel Santana's finger on the trigger, could sense the tension in the officer's body that suggested he was serious about using deadly force. But Jordan could also feel Robert Chen's pulse under his hands, weak but still present, still fighting, still indicating that a life could be saved if someone was willing to risk everything to save it. Jordan Ellis had been a paramedic for 23 years, had saved 1,847 lives, had taken an oath to preserve human life regardless of personal cost. He had never broken that oath, had never let fear or threats or personal danger prevent him from doing everything possible to keep someone alive. He wasn't going to start tonight. Officer Justin Santana pointed his service weapon directly at Jordan Ellis's head, while the paramedic's hands were deep inside a dying man's chest, performing emergency compressions that were the only thing keeping blood flowing to a father's brain. The barrel of Justin Santana's service weapon felt cold against Jordan Ellis's skull, but not as cold as Robert Chen's skin was becoming under Jordan's blood-covered hands. 60 seconds. That's what Jordan estimated he had left before Robert's brain began dying from lack of oxygen, before the window for saving this man's life closed permanently. 60 seconds to choose between his own survival and his oath to preserve human life at any cost. Jordan's fingers found Robert's pulse again, weak, irregular, but still there, still fighting. 59, Jordan counted silently, pressing down on Robert's chest in the rhythm he'd learned 23 years ago, the rhythm that had become as automatic as breathing. 58. "This is your last warning," Santana hissed, his voice tight with the kind of authority that had never been questioned, never been defied, never been forced to confront the possibility that a badge might not be enough to make a black man stop trying to save a white man's life. Jordan could hear the crowd of bystanders beyond the police tape, their voices rising with confusion and anger as they realized what they were witnessing. Someone was shouting, "He's a paramedic." Another voice, an older woman, was saying, "That man is trying to save someone's life." But the voices felt distant, muffled by the sound of Jordan's own heartbeat and the wet, labored breathing of the man dying beneath his hands. 55, 54, 53. Robert's eyes were still open, still focused on Jordan's face, with the desperate trust of someone who understood that this stranger in a uniform was the only thing standing between him and death. Jordan had seen that look thousands of times before, but never while someone was pointing a gun at his head, never while his own life was being threatened for the crime of refusing to let someone die. "You think I won't do it?" Santana's voice was getting higher, more strained, as if the officer was becoming increasingly frustrated by Jordan's refusal to comply with orders that would result in Robert Chen's death. "You think I won't pull this trigger?" Jordan didn't answer. He couldn't spare the breath, couldn't waste the mental energy on conversation, when every ounce of his concentration needed to be focused on keeping Robert's blood circulating, keeping his brain alive, keeping his heart beating long enough to get him to an operating room where surgeons could repair the damage that a bullet had done to his chest. 50, 49, 48. Jordan could feel the blood seeping through his fingers despite the pressure he was applying to Robert's wound. The trauma bandages were soaked through, and Jordan knew he needed to get Robert into the ambulance within the next 30 seconds or risk losing him to blood loss. But the ambulance was 20 feet away, and Officer Justin Santana was standing between Jordan and the vehicle with a loaded weapon and apparently no concern for the life that was bleeding out on the sidewalk. From somewhere in the crowd, Jordan heard a new sound, the distinctive electronic beep of a smartphone recording video, then another, then several more. Jordan realized that multiple people were filming this confrontation, that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds was going to be preserved forever, uploaded to social media, shared across the internet, examined and analyzed and debated by people who had never held a dying man in their hands while someone pointed a gun at their head. 45, 44, 43. Robert's pulse was getting weaker. Jordan could feel it fading under his fingertips, could see the grayish pallor spreading across Robert's face as his body began the process of shutting down non-essential functions to preserve what little blood was left for his heart and brain. Jordan had maybe 30 seconds before Robert entered irreversible shock, before even the best emergency room in the world wouldn't be able to bring him back. "Sir," Jordan said, his voice calm despite the weapon pressed against his skull, "this man has a wife and children. They're watching from over there. If you make me stop what I'm doing, you're going to make them watch their father die." Jordan tilted his head slightly, indicating the direction where Robert's family was being held back by other police officers. Jordan could see them through his peripheral vision. A woman in her 40s, probably Robert's wife, and two children who looked like they were in elementary school. The woman was crying, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other reaching toward the scene as if she could somehow will her husband back to health through pure desperate need. 40, 39, 38. For a moment, Jordan thought Santana might be wavering. The pressure of the gun barrel against his head seemed to lessen slightly, and Jordan could hear the officer's breathing becoming more rapid, more uncertain, as if he was beginning to realize the full implications of what he was doing, threatening to kill a paramedic who was trying to save someone's life, in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of a dying man's family. But then Santana's voice returned, harder than before, as if he had made a decision that there was no turning back from. "I don't care about his family. I care about you following orders when a police officer gives them to you." Jordan felt his stomach tighten with the realization that he was dealing with someone who had moved beyond rational thinking, someone who had reached the point where maintaining authority was more important than preserving human life. Jordan had encountered officers like this before, men who had been given badges and guns and told they represented order, but who had never learned the difference between authority and power, between command and control. 35, 34, 33. Robert's breathing was becoming more shallow, more irregular. Jordan could see that Robert was slipping into the early stages of hypovolemic shock, the condition that occurred when the human body lost too much blood to maintain normal cardiovascular function. Jordan had maybe 20 more seconds before Robert's condition became irreversible, before all the medical technology in the world wouldn't be enough to bring him back. "Officer Santana." The voice came from behind them, sharp and authoritative. "What the hell are you doing?" Jordan looked up and saw Sergeant Patricia Valdez approaching the scene, her face tight with anger and confusion as she took in the sight of one of her officers, pointing a weapon at a paramedic who was clearly trying to save someone's life. Valdez was a 20-year veteran who had worked her way up through the ranks by being both competent and careful, and Jordan could see in her expression that she understood exactly how bad this situation looked. "Sergeant, this suspect was interfering with the crime scene," Santana said, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone who was trying to justify actions that couldn't be justified. "I ordered him to step away from the victim, and he refused to comply." "He's a paramedic, you idiot," Valdez snapped. "He's trying to save the victim's life." 30, 29, 28. Jordan could feel Robert's pulse becoming even weaker, could see that Robert's eyes were starting to lose focus. They were running out of time, and Jordan knew that if he didn't get Robert into the ambulance within the next 20 seconds, Robert Chen was going to die on this sidewalk while his family watched and while bystanders recorded the whole thing on their phones. "Sergeant, I need to get this patient to the hospital immediately," Jordan said, his voice steady but urgent. "He's lost too much blood, and if we don't get him into surgery within the next few minutes, he's not going to make it." Valdez looked down at Robert, saw the amount of blood on the concrete, saw the grayish color of Robert's skin, and immediately understood the medical reality of the situation. She turned to Santana with an expression that suggested she was about to end his career. "Holster your weapon. Now." "Sergeant." This man was not following direct orders from a police officer. "Holster your weapon right now, or I'm going to have you arrested for assault with a deadly weapon." Jordan felt the pressure of the gun barrel ease slightly against his head, but Santana didn't holster the weapon. Jordan could sense that the officer was trapped between his sergeant's direct order and his own unwillingness to admit that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. 25, 24, 23. Robert's pulse was barely detectable now. Jordan could see that Robert's breathing was becoming agonalo, the irregular, gasping breaths that indicated someone was dying. Jordan had maybe 15 seconds before Robert's heart stopped beating, before CPR became the only thing keeping him alive, before even that wouldn't be enough. "I need to move him to the ambulance," Jordan said, looking up at Sergeant Valdez. "I can't wait any longer." Valdez nodded. "Do what you need to do." Jordan began preparing to lift Robert onto a transport gurney, but he could feel that Santana still hadn't holstered his weapon, could sense that the officer was still pointing the gun at his head, even though his sergeant had directly ordered him to stand down. 2019-18. Jordan made a decision that went against every survival instinct he had developed over 23 years of working in dangerous situations. He turned his back on Officer Justin Santana and his loaded service weapon and began the process of moving Robert Chen to the ambulance where Jordan could provide the kind of advanced medical care that might still save Robert's life. As Jordan lifted Robert onto the gurney, he could hear Santana behind him, the officer's voice tight with rage and frustration. "This isn't over." Jordan didn't respond. He was too busy trying to save a man's life while the clock counted down the final seconds before death became permanent. 15, 14, 13. Jordan pushed the gurney toward the ambulance, Sergeant Valdez clearing the way, other officers stepping aside to let the paramedic through. Jordan could hear Robert's family calling out, the wife crying, the children asking if their father was going to be okay, voices full of the kind of desperate hope that families cling to when someone they love is balanced on the edge between life and death. 10, 9, 8. Jordan lifted Robert into the ambulance and immediately began preparing the advanced life support equipment that would give Robert the best possible chance of surviving the trip to the hospital. IV fluids to replace lost blood volume, cardiac monitor to track heart rhythm, oxygen to ensure his brain was getting what it needed to survive. 7, 6, 5. Jordan found a vein in Robert's arm and started an IV line, pushing fluids to support Robert's blood pressure, medications to strengthen his heart's contractions, everything that modern emergency medicine could provide to fight against death. 4, 3, 2. Robert's pulse strengthened slightly under Jordan's fingers. His breathing became more regular. The grayish pallor began to fade from his skin as the IV fluid started to restore his blood volume. 1. Robert Chen opened his eyes and looked directly at Jordan Ellis. "Thank you," Robert whispered. Jordan felt the ambulance doors close behind him as they began the race to the hospital, leaving Officer Justin Santana standing on the sidewalk with his service weapon still in his hand, watching the man whose life he had tried to prevent from being saved disappear into the night with the paramedic who had refused to let a badge become more important than breathing. The ambulance carrying Robert Chen and Jordan Ellis disappeared into the night, its red lights fading into distant strobes against the darkness. But Officer Justin Santana remained frozen on the sidewalk outside Miller's Grocery, with his service weapon still drawn, his fingers still on the trigger, his eyes still focused on the empty space where a black paramedic had justified his authority and saved a man's life. Sergeant Patricia Valdez approached Santana slowly, her own hand resting on her weapon, not as a threat but as a precaution. In 20 years of police work, she had seen officers break under pressure, had watched good cops make bad decisions when adrenaline and authority collided in ways that turned routine situations into career-ending disasters. But she had never seen anything quite like what had just happened. A police officer pointing a loaded weapon at a paramedic who was performing emergency medical care on a dying man. "Santana," Valdez said, her voice calm but firm. "Holster your weapon." Santana blinked as if he was coming out of a trance and slowly lowered his gun. But he didn't holster it immediately, and Valdez could see in his expression that he was still processing what had just occurred, still trying to construct a narrative that would justify his actions to himself and to anyone who might question his judgment. "Sergeant, that man was interfering with a crime scene," Santana said, his voice carrying the defensive tone of someone who was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "I gave him a direct order to step away from the victim, and he refused to comply. I had to maintain control of the situation." Valdez looked down at the blood staining the concrete, then back at Santana's face, searching for any sign that the officer understood the magnitude of what he had just done. She saw none. "Santana, that was a paramedic. He was trying to save someone's life. You pointed your weapon at a medical professional who was performing emergency care." "I don't care what his job title is," Santana replied, finally holstering his weapon but maintaining the rigid posture of someone who believed he had acted correctly. "When a police officer gives an order, people need to follow it. End of discussion." Around them, the other officers who had responded to the original call were beginning to process what they had witnessed. Officer Janet Rodriguez, who had lifted the police tape to let Jordan through just 20 minutes earlier, was staring at Santana with an expression of disbelief. Officer Michael Torres, a 15-year veteran who had worked with Santana before, was shaking his head slowly, as if he couldn't quite accept what he had seen. Beyond the police line, the crowd of bystanders was growing larger and more agitated. Valdez could hear voices rising in anger, people shouting questions about why a cop had pointed a gun at someone who was trying to save a life. She could see the glow of cell phone screens throughout the crowd, and she knew that whatever had just happened was being recorded, uploaded, shared across social media platforms, where context would be lost and narratives would be shaped by 30-second video clips and inflammatory headlines. "Rodriguez," Valdez called out, "I need you to start taking statements from witnesses. Find out who saw what and when." Rodriguez nodded and began moving toward the crowd. But Valdez could see the reluctance in her movements, the hesitation of an officer who didn't want to collect evidence that might be used against a fellow cop. It was a reaction Valdez had seen before, the thin blue line mentality that prioritized loyalty to the badge over accountability to the public, and it was exactly the kind of thinking that turned isolated incidents into systemic scandals. Valdez turned her attention back to Santana, who was now staring at the blood on the sidewalk with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that his actions might have consequences beyond his immediate control. "Santana, I need you to give me your version of events," Valdez said, pulling out her notebook. "Start from the beginning. What made you draw your weapon on that paramedic?" Santana was quiet for a moment, and Valdez could see him working through the story he wanted to tell, the version of events that would make his actions seem reasonable and justified. She had seen this process before, had watched officers construct narratives that transformed their mistakes into heroic decisions, their poor judgment into necessary enforcement. "When I arrived on scene, the victim was already down," Santana began, his voice taking on the formal tone that officers used when they were giving official statements. "I observed a black male, in what appeared to be medical clothing, approaching the victim in an aggressive manner. Given the circumstances of the shooting and the possibility that this individual might be connected to the perpetrator, I determined that he posed a potential threat to the victim's safety." Valdez stopped writing and looked up at Santana. "You thought the paramedic was connected to the shooter?" "I had no way of knowing who he was or what his intentions were," Santana replied. "All I saw was an unidentified individual making physical contact with a gunshot victim. My training tells me to secure the scene and protect potential victims from further harm." His ambulance was parked right behind the police line. Santana. He was clearly identified as emergency medical personnel. "I didn't see his vehicle," Santana said, his voice becoming more defensive. "And even if he was a paramedic, that doesn't give him the right to ignore direct orders from a police officer." Valdez felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same feeling she got when she realized that a situation was going to become much more complicated than it initially appeared. She had been hoping that Santana would acknowledge his error, would admit that he had made a mistake in the heat of the moment, would show some understanding of how his actions might be perceived by the public and the media. Instead, he seemed determined to justify what was clearly an unjustifiable action. "Santana, do you understand that you pointed a loaded weapon at someone who was trying to save a man's life?" "I pointed my weapon at someone who was refusing to follow lawful orders from a police officer," Santana corrected. "The fact that he claimed to be providing medical care doesn't change the fact that he was interfering with police business." Valdez closed her notebook and looked around the scene, taking in the blood on the concrete, the crowd of angry bystanders, the other officers who were avoiding eye contact with their colleague. She had been a sergeant for 8 years, had handled dozens of officer-involved incidents, had written countless reports, and conducted numerous internal investigations. But she had never dealt with anything quite like this, had never been forced to confront the possibility that one of her officers had literally threatened to kill someone for the crime of trying to save a life. Officer Torres approached them, his face grim. "Sergeant, we've got a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Multiple witnesses are saying that Santana threatened to shoot the paramedic if he didn't stop treating the victim. One woman says she heard him say he was going to pull the trigger." Valdez felt the knot in her stomach tighten. "How many witnesses?" "At least 6 people have given similar statements." "And?" Torres paused, glancing at Santana before continuing. "Some of them were recording with their phones." The implications hit Valdez immediately. In a few hours, video of this incident would be circulating on social media. News outlets would be picking up the story, and the department would be facing questions about why one of their officers had pointed a gun at a paramedic. The fact that the paramedic was black and had ultimately saved the victim's life would only intensify the scrutiny and the outrage. "Has anyone contacted the chief?" Valdez asked. "Rodriguez is making the call now," Torres replied. "But Sergeant, there's something else you need to know about Santana." Valdez looked at Torres, noting the uncomfortable expression on his face. "What is it?" Torres glanced at Santana again, then lowered his voice. "This isn't the first time he's had issues with, how do I put this, interactions with black civilians." Valdez felt her heart rate increase. "What kind of issues?" 6 months ago, he arrested a black teenager for jaywalking. The kid ended up with a broken nose and 2 cracked ribs. Santana claimed the kid resisted arrest, but there were witnesses who said the kid never touched him. Was there an investigation? Internal Affairs looked into it, but the kid's family didn't want to press charges. They said they were afraid of retaliation. The case was closed without any disciplinary action. Valdez felt the knot in her stomach turn into a cold weight. What else? Last year, he pulled over a black family for suspicious behavior at 2 in the morning. Turned out they were coming home from the hospital after visiting a sick relative. He had the father face down on the ground with a gun to his head, while the mother and kids watched from the car. Jesus Christ, Valdez muttered. How many incidents are we talking about? Those are just the ones I know about, Torres said. There might be others. Valdez looked at Santana, who was standing a few feet away, apparently oblivious to the conversation that was determining his professional future. She realized that what had happened tonight wasn't an isolated incident, wasn't a good cop making a bad decision under pressure. It was part of a pattern, a series of interactions that suggested Officer Justin Santana had a problem with black people that went far beyond the usual tensions between police and the communities they served. Sergeant Valdez, came a voice from behind her. She turned to see Officer Rodriguez approaching with her cell phone in her hand. I just spoke to Chief Morrison. He wants to see you and Santana at headquarters immediately. Valdez nodded, then looked back at Santana. You're coming with me to see the chief. What for? Santana asked, his voice carrying the first hint of concern he had shown all evening. To explain why you pointed a gun at a paramedic who was trying to save someone's life, Valdez replied, and to discuss your future with this department. As they walked toward their patrol cars, Valdez's radio crackled with an update from the hospital. All units, be advised that the gunshot victim from Miller's Grocery has been stabilized and is expected to make a full recovery. Medical personnel report that the paramedics' quick action and refusal to abandon treatment were directly responsible for saving the victim's life. Valdez glanced at Santana, wondering if the irony of the situation would penetrate his defensive posture. The man whose life Santana had tried to prevent from being saved was going to live, and the paramedic Santana had threatened to kill was being credited as a hero. But Santana showed no reaction to the radio update, no acknowledgement that his actions might have resulted in an innocent man's death. He simply got into his patrol car and followed Valdez toward headquarters, where his career in law enforcement was about to come to an end. Police Chief Daniel Morrison had been running the department for 12 years, long enough to know the difference between a bad night and a career-ending catastrophe. The phone call from Sergeant Valdez had woken him from the first decent sleep he'd gotten in weeks, and the words she'd used, officer pointed weapon at paramedic, black medical professional, saving white victim's life, multiple witnesses with video, had sent ice water through his veins faster than any alarm clock ever could. By the time Morrison arrived at headquarters at 1:30 a.m., word of the incident had already begun spreading through the department's informal communication networks. Officers were texting each other, sharing whispered conversations in hallways, trying to piece together what had happened outside Miller's Grocery and what it might mean for all of them. Morrison could feel the tension in the building the moment he walked through the front doors, could see it in the way officers avoided eye contact, could hear it in the careful neutrality of their voices when they greeted him. Morrison found Sergeant Valdez waiting in his office, her face drawn with exhaustion and something else. The expression of someone who had witnessed something that challenged everything she thought she understood about the people she worked with every day. She had been one of Morrison's most reliable supervisors, a steady presence, who could handle difficult situations with the kind of calm professionalism that prevented minor incidents from becoming major scandals. If Valdez was shaken, Morrison knew the situation was worse than he had initially imagined. "Where's Santana?" Morrison asked, as he settled behind his desk. "Interview room 3, Valdez replied. "He's been waiting for about 20 minutes. "What's his state of mind?" Valdez was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. "Chief, I don't think he understands what he did wrong." Morrison felt his heart sink. In his experience, officers who couldn't recognize their own mistakes were the most dangerous kind, the ones who would repeat their errors until someone got killed or the department got sued into bankruptcy. "Give me the short version." At approximately 11:47 p.m., we responded to a shooting at Miller's Grocery. The victim, Robert Chen, had suffered a gunshot wound to the chest and was losing blood rapidly. Paramedic Jordan Ellis arrived on scene and began providing emergency medical care. Officer Santana ordered the paramedic to stop treatment and step away from the victim. When Ellis refused and continued trying to save Chen's life, Santana drew his service weapon and pointed it at the paramedic's head, threatening to shoot him if he didn't comply. Morrison closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of the headache that would probably last for the next 6 months. Please tell me there weren't any witnesses. 8 confirmed witnesses, Chief, and at least 3 of them were recording with their phones. Jesus Christ. Morrison opened his eyes and looked at Valdez. What happened to the victim? He survived. The paramedic was able to stabilize him and get him to the hospital. Doctors say Ellis's refusal to stop treatment saved Chen's life. Morrison felt the situation crystallize in his mind with the brutal clarity that came with years of crisis management. A white police officer had threatened to kill a black paramedic for trying to save a white man's life. The entire incident had been recorded by multiple witnesses, and the paramedic's actions had ultimately been vindicated by medical professionals. There was no version of this story that wouldn't result in national headlines, federal investigations, and the kind of public scrutiny that could destroy careers and topple administrations. What's Santana's explanation? He claims the paramedic was interfering with the crime scene and refusing to follow lawful orders. He says he had no way of knowing Ellis was actually a medical professional and thought he might be connected to the shooting. The paramedic arrived in an ambulance, right? Yes, and Officer Rodriguez personally escorted him through the police perimeter. Morrison stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the parking lot where a few late-shift officers were ending their patrols. In a few hours, the media would be calling, asking questions he didn't have good answers for. By afternoon, protesters would probably be gathering outside the building, demanding accountability and reform. By the end of the week, federal investigators would be requesting files and interviewing officers about departmental practices and training procedures. Chief, Valdez said quietly, there's something else you need to know. Morrison turned back toward her, bracing himself for additional bad news. What is it? This isn't Santana's first incident involving black civilians. Officer Torres told me about at least 2 other cases where Santana used excessive force against black individuals under questionable circumstances. Why wasn't I informed about these incidents? Because they were handled at the patrol level, never escalated to formal complaints. Internal Affairs looked into one of them, but the victim's family didn't want to pursue charges. Morrison felt his headache intensify. Get me those files, all of them. I want to review every report, every witness statement, every piece of paper that has Santana's name on it. Yes, sir. And Valdez, I want you to understand that what happens in the next few hours is going to determine whether this department survives as a credible law enforcement agency. The public is going to be watching every move we make, every decision we take, every word we say. If we handle this wrong, we're all going to be looking for new jobs. Valdez nodded, her expression grim. I understand, Chief. Morrison walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back at his sergeant. In your professional opinion, is Santana fit to continue serving as a police officer? Valdez was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison could see her struggling with the implications of her answer. She was being asked to end a colleague's career, to cross the thin blue line that had protected police officers from accountability for generations. But she was also being asked to uphold the standards that separated legitimate law enforcement from armed thuggery. No, sir, Valdez said finally. I don't think he is. Morrison left his office and walked down the hallway toward interview room 3, where Officer Justin Santana was waiting to explain why he had pointed a loaded weapon at a paramedic who was trying to save someone's life. With each step, Morrison found himself hoping that Santana would show some recognition of the gravity of his actions, some understanding that his behavior had been both morally wrong and professionally disastrous. But Morrison's 12 years of experience told him that hope was probably misplaced. Morrison opened the door to interview room 3 and found Santana sitting at the metal table, his uniform still stained with Robert Chen's blood. His expression a mixture of defensiveness and confusion. Santana looked up as Morrison entered, and for a moment, the chief thought he saw a flicker of remorse in the officer's eyes. But when Santana spoke, his voice carried the same rigid certainty that had led him to threaten a paramedic's life. "Chief, I want you to know that I followed proper procedures tonight. I maintained control of a volatile situation and protected the integrity of a crime scene." Morrison sat down across from Santana and studied the officer's face, searching for any sign that he understood the absurdity of his statement. "Santana, you pointed your weapon at a paramedic who was performing emergency medical care on a shooting victim." "I pointed my weapon at an individual who was refusing to comply with direct orders from a police officer," Santana corrected. "The fact that he claimed to be a paramedic doesn't change the fact that he was interfering with police business." "He wasn't claiming to be a paramedic, Santana. He was a paramedic. He arrived on scene in an ambulance. He was wearing medical identification, and he was performing standard emergency medical procedures. I had no way of knowing that at the time." Morrison felt his patience beginning to wear thin. "What exactly did you think was going to happen if you made the paramedic stop treating the victim?" Santana seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. "I thought we would be able to properly process the crime scene according to department protocols." "And what about Robert Chen? What did you think would happen to him if medical treatment was discontinued?" "That's not my responsibility, Chief. My job is to secure the scene and investigate the crime. Medical care is the EMT's job." "But you were preventing the EMT from doing his job." "I was enforcing lawful orders from a police officer." Morrison stared at Santana, trying to comprehend the mental framework that could lead someone to believe that preventing medical care was somehow consistent with police duties. It was as if Santana existed in a parallel universe where authority was an end in itself, where compliance with police orders was more important than preserving human life. "Santana, do you understand that Robert Chen could have died if the paramedic had followed your orders?" "That's a hypothetical question, Chief. My responsibility was to maintain control of the situation as it existed, not to speculate about what might have happened under different circumstances." Morrison closed his eyes and tried to control his breathing. In his 12 years as chief, he had dealt with officers who made mistakes, officers who used poor judgment, officers who let their emotions override their training. But he had never encountered an officer who seemed so completely disconnected from the fundamental purpose of law enforcement, so unable to understand that police work was supposed to serve the public good rather than simply assert institutional authority. "Santana, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you believe that your actions tonight were appropriate?" Santana didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. I believe I acted according to my training and department policies." Morrison opened his eyes and looked at Santana with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something that defied rational explanation. "You believe it was appropriate to threaten to kill a paramedic who was trying to save someone's life?" "I believe it was appropriate to use whatever force was necessary to maintain control of a crime scene and ensure compliance with lawful orders." Morrison stood up and walked to the small window that looked out into the hallway, where other officers were going about their business, unaware that their colleague was systematically destroying his own career with every word he spoke. Morrison had hoped that Santana would recognize his error, would show some remorse, would demonstrate that he understood the difference between legitimate law enforcement and the abuse of authority. Instead, Santana seemed determined to justify actions that were both indefensible and potentially criminal. Morrison turned back toward Santana and made a decision that would define his leadership for the remainder of his tenure as chief. "Officer Santana, you are hereby suspended from duty pending a full investigation into your conduct. You will surrender your badge, your weapon, and your identification card to Sergeant Valdez before you leave this building tonight." For the first time all evening, Santana's expression showed genuine surprise. "Chief, I don't understand. I followed proper procedures." "No, Santana, you didn't. You threatened to kill a medical professional who was performing emergency care on a shooting victim. You prevented a paramedic from saving someone's life. You pointed a loaded weapon at a man whose only crime was refusing to let another human being die." "I was maintaining order. You were threatening murder, Morrison interrupted. And based on the witness statements we've collected and the video evidence that exists, you may very well be facing criminal charges. Santana's face went pale. Criminal charges? Assault with a deadly weapon, at minimum. Possibly attempted murder, depending on how the district attorney's office interprets your actions. Morrison walked back to the table and sat down across from Santana, whose confident demeanor was finally beginning to crack. Santana, I want you to understand something. In a few hours, video of this incident is going to be all over social media. News outlets are going to pick up the story. Federal investigators are going to start asking questions about this department's training and supervision practices. Your actions tonight haven't just ended your career, they've put this entire organization under a microscope. Santana was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison could see him finally beginning to process the implications of what he had done. Chief, I was just trying to do my job. No, Santana, your job is to serve and protect the public. Tonight, you threatened to kill someone who was trying to save a life. That's not police work. That's something else entirely. Morrison stood up and walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back at Santana one final time. When you leave this building tonight, you're no longer a police officer. You're a private citizen who may be facing serious criminal charges. I suggest you get yourself a lawyer. As Morrison left interview room 3, he could hear Santana behind him, his voice cracking with the first hint of fear he had shown all night. Chief, wait, I think maybe we should talk about this. But Morrison kept walking, his mind already focused on the damage control measures he would need to implement over the next few days. The authority that Justin Santana had wielded so carelessly for years had finally broken, shattered by his own actions and the simple courage of a paramedic who had refused to let a badge become more important than breathing. At 3:17 a.m., 22-year-old college student Maria Santos uploaded a 47-second video to TikTok with the caption, "Cop points gun at paramedic, trying to save someone's life. Chat police brutality. Hero WTF." Maria had been walking home from her job at a late-night diner when she heard the commotion outside Miller's grocery, had pulled out her phone instinctively when she saw the police cars and ambulance, and had captured something that would be viewed 17 million times in the next 18 hours. The video was shaky, filmed from about 30 feet away, but it captured everything that mattered. Jordan Ellis, kneeling beside Robert Chen, his hands working frantically to stop the bleeding from the gunshot wound. Justin Santana, approaching from behind, his voice clearly audible as he ordered the paramedic to step away. Jordan's calm refusal, his explanation that the victim would die without immediate medical care. Santana drawing his weapon, pointing it directly at Jordan's head, the metallic click of the safety being disengaged. And through it all, Jordan's hands never stopping their life-saving work, never wavering despite the gun barrel pressed against his skull. Maria's video was the longest and clearest of the recordings, but it wasn't the only one. 8 different people had captured various angles of the confrontation, and by dawn, fragments of the incident were circulating across every social media platform: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube. The story spread with the viral velocity that only came with content that triggered fundamental emotions about justice, courage, and the abuse of authority. By 6 a.m., Jordan Ellis was trending nationally. By 8 a.m., major news outlets were picking up the story. By noon, it had gone international. Jordan Ellis woke up at 7:30 a.m. to discover that his life had changed forever while he slept. His phone had died sometime during the night, and when he plugged it in and turned it on, the device immediately began buzzing with notifications, text messages, missed calls, voicemails, social media alerts, hundreds of them, from numbers he didn't recognize, from news organizations, from friends and family who had seen the video and wanted to make sure he was okay. Jordan's first instinct was to assume there had been some kind of mistake, some technological glitch that had flooded his phone with random communications. But as he scrolled through the messages, he began to see recurring phrases. Saw the video. So proud of you. True hero. Standing up to that cop. It took Jordan several minutes to understand that the confrontation outside Miller's grocery had been recorded and was now being viewed by millions of people across the world. The first call Jordan returned was to his daughter Ashley, who was a sophomore at State University studying journalism. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry and pride in equal measure. "Dad, are you okay? I saw the video. I can't believe that cop pointed a gun at you. Are you hurt? Are you in trouble? The whole campus is talking about it." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Jordan said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "What video are you talking about?" "Dad, there's a video of you saving that man's life while a police officer held a gun to your head. It's everywhere. CNN is showing it. It's all over social media. People are calling you a hero." Jordan felt a strange disconnection from what his daughter was describing. He remembered the incident clearly. The pressure of Santana's gun against his skull. The desperation of trying to keep Robert Chen alive. The relief when Sergeant Valdez intervened and he was able to get Robert to the hospital. But the idea that his actions were being viewed and discussed by strangers around the world felt surreal, like she was describing something that had happened to someone else. "Have you heard anything about how Mr. Chen is doing?" Jordan asked. "The news says he's going to make a full recovery because you refused to stop treating him. Dad, you saved his life. That man is alive because you wouldn't let a bully with a badge intimidate you." Jordan felt the weight of what had happened beginning to settle on his shoulders. In the moment, his decision to continue treating Robert had felt automatic, instinctive, the natural response of someone who had taken an oath to preserve human life. But in the clear light of morning, he began to understand the broader implications of what he had done and what could have happened if Santana had decided to pull the trigger. "Dad," Ashley continued, "you need to be careful. The news is saying that the police officer has been suspended, but there are also people online who are defending him, saying you should have followed his orders. Some of them are making threats." Jordan felt his chest tighten. "What kind of threats?" "Nothing specific, but there are people saying you were wrong to disobey a police officer, that you were disrespecting law enforcement. Some of them are using really ugly language." Jordan understood immediately what Ashley meant by ugly language. In his 23 years as a paramedic, he had encountered people who saw his skin color before they saw his uniform, who questioned his competence and authority based on assumptions about what black men were and weren't capable of. The idea that his refusal to let Robert Chen die was being characterized as disrespect for law enforcement felt like a perverse inversion of reality, but it didn't surprise him. After ending the call with Ashley, Jordan spent the next hour watching the video that had made him famous. Seeing himself from an outside perspective was disorienting. He looked calmer and more confident than he had felt, his hands steady and professional as he worked to save Robert's life. But what struck him most was Justin Santana's demeanor, the cold certainty in the officer's voice as he threatened to kill someone for trying to preserve human life. Jordan's phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize with a New York area code. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Mr. Ellis, this is Sarah Chen, Robert's wife. I wanted to call and thank you for saving my husband's life." Jordan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Mrs. Chen, how is Robert doing?" "He's going to be fine. The doctors say he would have died if you hadn't stabilized him at the scene." "Mr. Ellis, I watched the video of what happened, and I can't believe that police officer tried to stop you from helping Robert. You risked your own life to save my husband." "I was just doing my job, ma'am." "No, you were doing much more than that. When that officer pointed his gun at you, you could have walked away. You could have protected yourself. But you stayed with Robert. You kept working to save him, even when it meant risking your own life. My children almost lost their father last night, but they didn't because of your courage." Jordan wiped tears from his eyes as Mrs. Chen continued. "Mr. Ellis, I need you to know something. My family and I are going to support you however we can. If there are legal proceedings, if there are investigations, if people try to make trouble for you, we're going to stand with you. Robert is alive because you refused to let fear override your duty to help people." After ending the call with Mrs. Chen, Jordan tried to return to his normal routine, but it quickly became apparent that normal no longer existed. His phone continued ringing, with calls from reporters, producers, civil rights organizations, and well-wishers. A news van was parked outside his apartment building, and when he looked out his window, he could see a reporter and cameraman waiting on the sidewalk. Jordan realized he needed help navigating this new reality, so he called his older brother Marcus, a lawyer who specialized in civil rights cases. Marcus had been following the story since the early morning hours and was already developing a strategy for protecting Jordan from both legal and public relations challenges. "Jordan, you need to understand that this story is bigger than just what happened last night," Marcus said when they met for lunch at a restaurant across town. "This isn't just about one bad cop or one heroic paramedic. This is about everything that's wrong with policing in America, and you've become a symbol of something that a lot of people have been waiting to see." "What do you mean?" "You're a black professional who stood up to police authority and won. You refused to be intimidated. You saved a life, and you made a white cop look like a fool on camera. For a lot of people, especially in the black community, you represent the possibility that we don't have to be afraid of badges and uniforms, that we can stand our ground when we know we're right." Jordan understood what his brother was saying, but the weight of being a symbol felt overwhelming. "Marcus, I wasn't trying to make a political statement. I was trying to save someone's life. I know that, and that's exactly why your story is so powerful. You weren't protesting or demonstrating or trying to prove a point. You were just doing your job, being a professional, trying to help someone. And when a cop tried to stop you from helping, you refused to back down. That's the kind of quiet courage that changes things." As they talked, Marcus showed Jordan some of the social media response to the video. The overwhelming majority was supportive. People praising Jordan's bravery, calling him a hero, sharing stories about their own experiences with emergency medical personnel. But there was also a darker current of criticism, mostly from people who believe that civilians should always obey police orders regardless of circumstances. "Look at this," Marcus said, showing Jordan a comment thread on Facebook. "Some people are saying you were wrong to disobey a police officer, that you should have stepped away when he told you to, that Robert Chen's life wasn't worth risking a confrontation with law enforcement." Jordan read the comments with growing disbelief. "They're saying I should have let Robert die, rather than make a cop angry?" That's exactly what they're saying, and that tells you everything you need to know about how some people view the relationship between police authority and human life. Jordan spent the rest of the day trying to process his sudden transformation from anonymous public servant to national symbol. By evening, the story had been covered by every major news outlet, had been discussed on talk shows and social media platforms, had generated editorial responses from medical organizations and civil rights groups. The video of his confrontation with Justin Santana had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms. But perhaps more importantly, Jordan's story had prompted other people to come forward with their own experiences involving Officer Justin Santana. By the end of the day, 3 additional victims had contacted the police department and local news outlets with accounts of excessive force, racial profiling, and intimidation by the same officer who had threatened to kill Jordan for trying to save Robert Chen's life. The pattern that Officer Torres had described to Sergeant Valdez was now being exposed to public scrutiny, and it painted a picture of a police officer who had been allowed to abuse his authority for years without meaningful consequences. Santana's personnel file, obtained through public records requests, showed multiple citizen complaints, several use-of-force incidents involving black civilians, and a pattern of behavior that suggested he viewed his badge as a license to intimidate rather than a responsibility to serve. As Jordan prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken in less than 24 hours. He had gone to work expecting another routine shift, had responded to a medical emergency the same way he had responded to thousands of others over his career, and had made a simple decision to prioritize human life over police authority. That decision had saved Robert Chen's life, had ended Justin Santana's career, and had thrust Jordan into a national conversation about courage, authority, and the fundamental purpose of public service. Jordan's phone buzzed with one final message of the day. This one from the hospital where Robert Chen was recovering. It was a photo of Robert sitting up in bed, smiling weakly at the camera, with a message that read, "Thank you for giving me the chance to see my family again. You are the definition of a hero, Robert." Jordan looked at the photo for a long time, remembering the feeling of Robert's pulse under his fingers, the desperation of trying to keep a stranger alive while someone pointed a gun at his head. All the media attention, all the social media comments, all the political implications, none of it mattered as much as this simple fact: Robert Chen was alive, and his children still had their father. That, Jordan realized, was worth whatever came next. 3 days after the incident at Miller's Grocery, Jordan Ellis sat in a sterile conference room at police headquarters, facing a panel of investigators who would determine whether his actions that night had been appropriate, or whether he had, as some critics suggested, endangered public safety by defying police authority. The internal affairs investigation was supposed to be routine, a formality that would clear Jordan of any wrongdoing and focus attention on Justin Santana's conduct. But Jordan could sense tension in the room that suggested not everyone was convinced he had acted properly. Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez, who headed the Internal Affairs Division, sat at the center of the panel, flanked by Captain James Wright and Detective Sarah Kim. Martinez had a reputation for thoroughness and impartiality, but Jordan could see in her expression that she was struggling with the political implications of the case. The video of his confrontation with Santana had made Jordan a national hero to some and a symbol of anti-police defiance to others, and Martinez knew that her investigation would be scrutinized by both the media and federal authorities. "Mr. Ellis," Martinez began, her voice carefully neutral, "we appreciate you coming in to speak with us about the events of Tuesday night. I want to assure you that this investigation is focused on establishing the facts of what occurred and ensuring that appropriate action is taken based on those facts." Jordan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being treated more like a suspect than a witness. "I understand, Lieutenant. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Let's start with your arrival at the scene. When you first approached Mr. Chen, what was your assessment of his condition?" Jordan described his medical evaluation of Robert Chen's injuries, explaining the clinical indicators that had told him Robert was in immediate danger of dying from blood loss. He detailed the entry wound location, the bleeding patterns that suggested arterial damage, and the physiological signs of hypovolemic shock that meant Robert had perhaps 90 seconds before his condition became irreversible. The bullet had entered approximately 3 inches below the left collarbone, Jordan explained, his voice taking on the professional tone he used when discussing medical procedures. "Based on the angle of entry and the volume of blood loss, I assessed that the subclavian artery had likely been nicked. Mr. Chen's blood pressure was dropping rapidly, his skin was becoming cyanotic, and his breathing was becoming labored. These are all indicators of severe blood loss that requires immediate intervention." "What specific medical protocols guided your decision to begin treatment immediately?" Detective Kim asked. "The Emergency Medical Services Protocol for trauma victims with severe bleeding requires immediate pressure application to control hemorrhaging, establishment of IV access for fluid resuscitation, and rapid transport to a trauma center. The protocol specifically states that life-threatening injuries take priority over scene security considerations." Jordan went on to explain his training background, his certification in advanced cardiac life support, his experience with trauma cases, and the specific techniques he had used to stabilize Robert's condition. He described the pressure bandages, the IV catheter placement, the saline solution administration, and the cardiac monitoring that had been necessary to keep Robert alive during those critical minutes. "At what point did Officer Santana first interact with you?" Detective Kim asked. "I was approximately 3 minutes into treating Mr. Chen when Officer Santana approached and ordered me to step away from the patient," Jordan replied. "I explained that Mr. Chen was bleeding internally and would die without immediate medical intervention, but Officer Santana repeated his order more forcefully." "Did you identify yourself as a paramedic when Officer Santana first approached?" Captain Wright asked. "I was wearing my EMT uniform with clear medical identification, and my ambulance was parked directly behind the police perimeter. Officer Rodriguez had personally escorted me through the police line after verifying my credentials. There should have been no question about my identity or my authority to provide medical care." Captain Wright made a note, then looked up at Jordan with an expression that suggested he was skeptical of Jordan's account. "Mr. Ellis, did you consider complying with Officer Santana's directive and allowing other medical personnel to treat the victim?" Jordan felt a flash of anger at the question, but he kept his voice steady. "Captain, I was the only medical personnel on scene. The next closest ambulance was at least 8 minutes away, and Mr. Chen didn't have 8 minutes. He had maybe 90 seconds before blood loss became fatal." "But don't you think there's value in following police directives during an active crime scene investigation?" Wright pressed. "Couldn't your refusal to comply have created additional safety risks for everyone involved?" Jordan looked directly at Wright, wondering if the captain understood what he was suggesting. "Captain, are you asking me whether I should have let a man die, rather than inconvenience a police officer's investigation?" Wright's face reddened slightly. "I'm asking whether you considered the broader implications of defying police authority at an active crime scene." "The only implication I considered was that Robert Chen would die if I stopped providing medical care. Captain, I've been a paramedic for 23 years. I've worked hundreds of crime scenes with police officers. In every other case, law enforcement has facilitated medical care, not prevented it. What Officer Santana did was completely outside normal protocols." Lieutenant Martinez intervened before Wright could respond. "Mr. Ellis, we're not questioning the value of human life. We're trying to understand the competing priorities and obligations that were in play during this incident." "Lieutenant, there were no competing priorities," Jordan said firmly. "A man was dying, and I had the training and equipment to save his life. That's not a priority. That's an absolute obligation." Martinez made a note in her file, then looked up at Jordan with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand the moral clarity that had guided his actions. "Mr. Ellis, at what point did Officer Santana draw his weapon?" "When I refused to stop treating Mr. Chen, Officer Santana ordered me to step away a second time, and when I continued working, he drew his service weapon and pointed it directly at my head." "What went through your mind at that moment?" Jordan was quiet for a moment, remembering the feeling of cold metal against his skull, the sound of Santana's voice threatening to kill him, the desperate pulse of Robert Chen under his hands. "I thought about my daughter, about whether I would ever see her again. I thought about Mr. Chen's family, about what would happen to them if I let him die. And I thought about the oath I took when I became a paramedic, about my responsibility to preserve human life regardless of personal cost." "Did you fear for your own safety?" Detective Kim asked. "Of course I did. But my fear for my own life wasn't greater than my obligation to save someone else's. I've been in dangerous situations before. House fires, violent crime scenes, accidents with unstable vehicles. Part of being a paramedic is accepting that sometimes you have to risk your own safety to help others." Captain Wright leaned forward, his expression still skeptical. "Mr. Ellis, don't you think your decision to continue treating the victim, despite direct orders from a police officer, could have escalated the situation and put everyone at greater risk?" Jordan stared at Wright for a long moment, trying to comprehend the logic behind the question. "Captain, the situation was already escalated. A police officer was pointing a loaded weapon at a paramedic for trying to save someone's life. I'm not sure how it could have been more escalated. But if you had complied with Officer Santana's orders, the confrontation might have been avoided entirely, and Mr. Chen would be dead." Wright fell silent, apparently realizing that his line of questioning was leading to conclusions that no reasonable person could defend. Lieutenant Martinez took over the interview, focusing on Jordan's medical training, his assessment of Robert Chen's condition, and the specific procedures he had used to stabilize the victim. "Walk us through your medical decision-making process," Martinez said. "How did you prioritize your treatment of Mr. Chen?" Jordan explained his triage assessment, the ABC protocol that prioritized airway, breathing, and circulation in trauma victims. He described how he had evaluated Robert's airway and breathing, found them adequate, then focused on the circulation problem caused by the gunshot wound. He detailed his application of direct pressure to control bleeding, his establishment of IV access to replace lost blood volume, and his monitoring of vital signs to assess the effectiveness of his interventions. The key factor was time, Jordan emphasized. With arterial bleeding, every second matters. I could see that Mr. Chen's blood pressure was dropping, his heart rate was increasing to compensate, and his skin color was changing. These are all signs that the body is going into shock from blood loss. If I had stopped treatment to comply with Officer Santana's orders, Mr. Chen would have progressed to irreversible shock within minutes. How certain were you of your medical assessment? Detective Kim asked. Completely certain. I've treated hundreds of gunshot victims over my career. I know what arterial bleeding looks like. I know the signs of hypovolemic shock, and I know how quickly someone can die from blood loss. There was no doubt in my mind that Mr. Chen would die if I stopped providing care. As the interview progressed, Jordan began to understand that the investigation was not really about determining whether his actions had been appropriate. It was about creating an official record that would withstand public scrutiny and provide legal protection for the department. The investigators needed to document that Jordan had acted within his professional obligations, that his medical decisions had been sound, and that his refusal to abandon Robert Chen had been justified by the circumstances. Mr. Ellis, Martinez said, as the formal interview continued, has anything like this ever happened to you before? Have you ever had a police officer interfere with your medical treatment of a patient? Never, Jordan replied emphatically. In 23 years as a paramedic, I've worked with thousands of police officers at countless crime scenes. There's usually excellent cooperation between law enforcement and emergency medical services. We understand that we have different roles but the same ultimate goal, protecting public safety and preserving life. Have you ever had conflicts with police officers over medical decisions? Wright asked, apparently still looking for evidence that Jordan was somehow anti-police. I've had disagreements about scene safety, about whether it was safe to approach a patient or whether we needed to wait for additional backup. But those were legitimate safety concerns. I've never had an officer try to prevent me from treating someone who was dying. Martinez asked Jordan to describe his relationship with the police department, his previous interactions with officers, and his understanding of the proper protocols for emergency scenes involving both law enforcement and medical personnel. Jordan explained that he had worked closely with police throughout his career, had participated in joint training exercises, and had always viewed law enforcement as partners in public safety. I want to be clear about something, Jordan said, looking directly at Captain Wright. What Officer Santana did had nothing to do with legitimate police work. He wasn't concerned about scene safety. He wasn't following any protocol I've ever heard of, and he wasn't trying to protect anyone. He was using his authority to intimidate someone who was trying to save a life. After Jordan left the formal interview, Lieutenant Martinez convened a separate meeting with the officers who had witnessed the incident. One by one, they provided their accounts of what they had seen, and a clear picture began to emerge of an officer whose behavior had shocked even his own colleagues. Officer Janet Rodriguez was the first to testify, her voice shaking as she described watching Santana threaten Jordan's life. Lieutenant, I've never seen anything like it. That paramedic was clearly trying to save someone's life, and Santana was going to shoot him for it. I've been on the force for 12 years, and I've never seen an officer point a weapon at a medical professional. Rodriguez went on to describe the crowd's reaction, the way bystanders had become increasingly agitated as they realized what was happening. People were shouting that Ellis was a paramedic, that he was trying to help the victim, but Santana didn't seem to care. He was completely focused on forcing Ellis to comply with his orders, even though those orders would have resulted in the victim's death. Officer Michael Torres provided more context about Santana's history, describing the pattern of aggressive behavior toward black civilians that he had observed over the past 2 years. He seemed to view every interaction with a black person as a potential confrontation, as if he was looking for reasons to assert his authority rather than ways to serve the community. Torres described specific incidents he had witnessed: traffic stops that lasted far longer than necessary, searches conducted without apparent justification, arrests for minor violations that other officers would have handled with warnings. There was a pattern, Torres said. Santana treated black civilians differently than white civilians, even in identical situations. Why didn't you report these observations? Martinez asked. Torres looked uncomfortable. I should have, but it's difficult to report a fellow officer based on impressions and patterns rather than specific policy violations. And honestly, I was hoping that someone else would address the problem, that his supervisors would notice and take action. But the most damning testimony came from Officer David Chen. no relation to the shooting victim, who had worked as Santana's partner for 6 months the previous year. Chen had requested a transfer after witnessing what he described as a pattern of racially motivated harassment and excessive force. "Lieutenant, Santana once told me that black people needed to be kept in line, that they would take advantage of any sign of weakness from law enforcement," Chen testified. He said his job was to make sure they understood who was in charge, regardless of what the situation called for. Chen described incidents where Santana had escalated routine encounters into confrontations, where he had used excessive force during arrests, where he had made derogatory comments about black civilians. He talked about black people like they were inherently criminal, like they were a threat that needed to be controlled rather than citizens who deserved to be served. "Did you report these statements?" Martinez asked. Chen's expression was uncomfortable. "I should have, but I was new to the department and I was afraid of being labeled a troublemaker. I thought requesting a transfer would be enough to distance myself from his behavior without having to make formal accusations against another officer." Martinez understood the dynamics that Chen was describing. Police departments often functioned as insular communities where loyalty to colleagues was valued above accountability to the public, and officers who reported misconduct risked being ostracized by their peers. But those same dynamics had allowed Justin Santana to continue his pattern of abuse for years without meaningful intervention. Additional officers came forward during the investigation, each providing pieces of a puzzle that revealed the extent of Santana's misconduct. Officer Lisa Park described watching Santana conduct unnecessary pat-down searches of black teenagers. Officer Robert Martinez recounted Santana's comments about black families during domestic disturbance calls. Officer Jennifer Walsh provided documentation of citizen complaints that had been minimized or dismissed by supervisors. As the investigation continued, more evidence emerged about Santana's conduct. The department's computer records showed that he had conducted traffic stops of black drivers at a rate nearly 3 times higher than his colleagues. Despite being assigned to the same patrol areas, his use of force reports showed a pattern of aggressive tactics employed almost exclusively against black civilians, and his arrest records revealed that he had a tendency to charge black suspects with resisting arrest and assaulting a police officer, even in cases where witnesses contradicted his accounts. The evidence painted a picture of an officer who had weaponized his badge and uniform to intimidate and harass members of the black community, using the authority of law enforcement to satisfy his own racial prejudices. What had happened to Jordan Ellis wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of unchecked behavior that had escalated from harassment to the threat of deadly force. On Friday afternoon, Lieutenant Martinez completed her investigation and submitted her report to Chief Morrison. The findings were unambiguous. Officer Justin Santana had violated multiple department policies, had acted outside the scope of his authority, and had committed what appeared to be criminal acts in threatening to kill a paramedic who was performing emergency medical care. The report also included recommendations for policy changes designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. Martinez suggested mandatory training on the role of emergency medical personnel at crime scenes, clearer guidelines for officer interaction with medical professionals, and enhanced supervision of officers who showed patterns of excessive force or discriminatory behavior. But perhaps most importantly, the report documented the courage and professionalism that Jordan Ellis had displayed under extraordinary circumstances. Martinez wrote, "Mr. Ellis's actions represent the highest standards of public service. When faced with a choice between his own safety and his obligation to preserve human life, he chose to honor his oath as a medical professional. His decision to continue treating Mr. Chen, despite threats to his own life, directly resulted in saving a man's life and represents the kind of courage that all public servants should aspire to demonstrate." As news of the internal affairs findings leaked to the media, public support for Jordan continued to grow. Medical organizations issued statements praising his professionalism, civil rights groups held rallies in his honor, and political leaders called for him to receive official recognition for his heroism. But Jordan himself remained focused on the simple fact that had motivated his actions from the beginning. Robert Chen was alive, and his family was whole. Everything else, the media attention, the political implications, the calls for police reform, was secondary to that fundamental truth. The investigation had concluded, the evidence had been documented, and the system had officially acknowledged what the public had known from the moment they saw the video. Jordan Ellis was a hero, and Justin Santana was a criminal who had hidden behind a badge for far too long. The Fraternal Order of Police Local 847 occupied a modest brick building on the east side of the city, but the power it wielded over the careers and legal fates of police officers was anything but modest. When news broke that Officer Justin Santana was facing potential criminal charges for threatening to kill a paramedic, Union President Frank Castellanos knew he was confronting the kind of case that could define his legacy and determine whether the Union maintained its traditional role as an impenetrable shield against accountability. Castellanos had been protecting police officers from consequences for 28 years, had mastered the art of transforming obvious misconduct into reasonable responses to challenging circumstances, had built a legal and public relations machine capable of defending the indefensible. But the video of Santana pointing a gun at Jordan Ellis while the paramedic tried to save Robert Chen's life presented challenges that even Castellanos' considerable skills would struggle to overcome. "The optics are terrible," admitted Union Attorney Patricia Hawkins as she reviewed the case files in Castellanos' office. "We have a white police officer threatening to kill a black paramedic who was trying to save a white man's life. The racial dynamics alone make this a nightmare. But add in the fact that the paramedic was performing life-saving medical care and we're looking at a public relations disaster." Castellanos nodded grimly. He had watched the viral video dozens of times, searching for any angle that might cast Santana's actions in a more favorable light. But every viewing only reinforced his growing conviction that this case was different from the others he had successfully defended over the years. Usually, police misconduct occurred in situations where facts were disputed, where witness accounts conflicted, where reasonable people could disagree about whether an officer's actions had been justified. But the video of Santana threatening Jordan Ellis was unambiguous, undeniable, and impossible to explain away. "What's our legal strategy?" Castellanos asked. Hawkins consulted her notes. "We argue that Santana was following his training regarding scene security, that he had legitimate concerns about contamination of evidence, and that his use of force was a reasonable response to someone who was refusing to comply with lawful orders." "And the gun to the paramedic's head?" "We characterize it as a necessary escalation to maintain control of a volatile situation." Castellanos rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar headache that came with defending cases where the facts were against him. "Patricia, do you actually believe any of that?" Hawkins was quiet for a moment. "Frank, I believe our job is to provide the best possible defense for our members, regardless of the circumstances. Whether I personally believe the defense is irrelevant." But even as the Union prepared its legal strategy, Castellanos knew that the battle would be fought as much in the court of public opinion as in any courtroom. The video had already shaped the narrative in ways that would be difficult to overcome. But Castellanos had learned over the years that public perception could be influenced through careful media management and strategic character assassination. The Union's first move was to retain crisis communications firm Henderson & Associates, specialists in reputation management for law enforcement agencies facing public scandals. Within 48 hours of taking the case, Henderson had developed a comprehensive strategy for shifting public attention away from Santana's actions and toward Jordan Ellis's background. "We need to humanize Santana and problematize Ellis," explained Henderson principal Rachel Morrison during a strategy meeting. "Santana becomes a dedicated officer who made a split-second decision under pressure. Ellis becomes someone with a history of confrontations with authority, someone who has a pattern of putting himself above the law." The campaign began subtly. Anonymous sources began providing information to friendly media outlets about Jordan Ellis's personnel file, highlighting any disciplinary actions, complaints, or negative performance reviews from his 23-year career. A website appeared featuring the other side of the story, questioning whether Ellis had been properly certified to perform the medical procedures he had used on Robert Chen. Social media accounts with names like Thin Blue Line 24/7 and Back the Blue began sharing posts suggesting that Ellis had a history of anti-police sentiment, that he had been looking for an opportunity to challenge law enforcement authority, that his actions had been motivated by political activism rather than medical necessity. The posts included selectively edited quotes from Ellis's social media accounts taken out of context to suggest hostility toward police. But the union's most aggressive tactic was to question Ellis's medical competence and suggest that his treatment of Robert Chen had been unnecessary and potentially harmful. The union hired Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician known for his willingness to provide expert testimony favorable to law enforcement, to review Ellis's medical decisions and identify any potential errors or deviations from standard protocols. Dr. Webb's report, leaked to sympathetic media outlets, claimed that Ellis had used excessive force in applying pressure to Chen's wound, that his IV placement had been unnecessarily aggressive, and that his decision to move Chen to the ambulance had created additional risk of complications. The report suggested that Chen's survival was due to the skill of hospital surgeons rather than Ellis's field treatment. This so-called hero may have actually endangered the victim's life through his reckless disregard for proper medical protocols, Webb told a local television station. The fact that Mr. Chen survived doesn't prove that Mr. Ellis's treatment was appropriate. It may simply mean that hospital personnel were able to correct the damage caused by improper field treatment. The character assassination campaign reached its peak when an anonymous tip led reporters to discover that Ellis had been arrested for disorderly conduct during a college protest 25 years earlier. The arrest, which had resulted in no charges and had occurred when Ellis was a 19-year-old student protesting budget cuts to financial aid programs, was presented as evidence of a lifelong pattern of anti-authority behavior. Jordan Ellis has a history of confronting law enforcement, claimed union spokesman Detective Ray Morrison during a press conference. This incident at Miller's Grocery wasn't about saving someone's life. It was about a man with a grudge against police officers using a medical emergency as an excuse to challenge legitimate law enforcement authority. But the union's campaign began to backfire almost immediately. Robert Chen's family, who had been quietly grateful for Ellis's heroism, decided to speak publicly about their experience and their outrage at seeing their son's savior attacked. Sarah Chen, Robert's wife, called her own press conference, flanked by her 2 children and her husband, who was still recovering from his injuries, but was determined to defend the man who had saved his life. "I watched Jordan Ellis risk his own life to save my husband," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I watched a police officer point a gun at a paramedic who was trying to keep my children from losing their father. And now I'm watching that same police department try to destroy the reputation of the man who made sure my family stayed together." Robert Chen, speaking slowly due to his injuries but with unmistakable clarity, addressed the camera directly. "Officer Santana tried to prevent Jordan Ellis from saving my life. The union is now trying to prevent Jordan Ellis from being recognized as the hero he is. I'm alive because Jordan Ellis was brave enough to do the right thing when it mattered most." The Chen family's intervention galvanized public support for Ellis and exposed the union's tactics as a desperate attempt to avoid accountability. Medical organizations that had been watching the case quietly now spoke out forcefully in defense of Ellis's actions and his character. The American Medical Association issued a statement declaring that Mr. Ellis's medical treatment of Mr. Chen was not only appropriate but exemplary. His decision to continue life-saving care, despite threats to his own safety, represents the highest standards of medical professionalism. The National Association of Emergency Medical Technicians went further, calling the union's attacks on Ellis a transparent attempt to deflect attention from criminal behavior by assassinating the character of a medical professional who risked his life to save another human being. As medical professionals rallied to Ellis's defense, investigative journalists began examining the union's role in covering up Santana's previous misconduct. Records requests revealed that the union had successfully defended Santana in at least 6 previous cases involving excessive force complaints, had negotiated settlements that included non-disclosure agreements with victims, and had lobbied against policy changes that would have increased oversight of officer conduct. The most damaging revelation came when reporter Jennifer Walsh of the City Tribune obtained internal union documents showing that leadership had been aware of Santana's pattern of racially motivated misconduct, but had continued to defend him because they viewed his cases as winnable fights against what they characterized as anti-police activism. One internal memo, written by union attorney Patricia Hawkins, stated, "Santana may have some rough edges, but he's exactly the kind of officer who gets results in challenging neighborhoods. The complaints against him are typical of what happens when officers are proactive in high-crime areas populated by people who don't respect law enforcement authority." Another document showed that the union had spent over $200,000 in legal fees defending Santana from various complaints and lawsuits over the past 3 years, a sum that would have been enough to fund additional training for dozens of officers or community outreach programs designed to improve police-community relations. Public reaction to the union's defense strategy was swift and harsh. Editorial boards that had historically supported law enforcement began calling for reform of police union practices. Civil rights organizations launched campaigns demanding that union contracts be renegotiated to eliminate protections for officers who engaged in misconduct. Perhaps most significantly, other police officers began speaking out against the union's tactics. Officer Janet Rodriguez, who had witnessed the confrontation at Miller's Grocery, gave an interview in which she criticized the union's attempt to defend the indefensible. "What Santana did was wrong, and everyone knows it," Rodriguez said. "Trying to destroy Jordan Ellis's reputation doesn't change the fact that Santana threatened to kill a paramedic for doing his job. As police officers, we should be supporting medical professionals, not threatening them." Officer Michael Torres, who had provided testimony about Santana's previous misconduct, went further in his criticism of the union's approach. "The union is supposed to protect good officers from unfair treatment, not protect bad officers from accountability. By defending Santana, they're making all of us look bad." The growing criticism from within law enforcement ranks created a crisis for union leadership. Younger officers, particularly those from diverse backgrounds, began questioning whether the union truly represented their interests or simply protected the worst elements within their profession. Officer Lisa Park, a 5-year veteran who had witnessed some of Santana's previous misconduct, submitted a formal complaint to union leadership about their defense strategy. "I joined this union because I thought it would help me be a better police officer," Park wrote. "Instead, I'm watching it defend someone who threatened to kill a paramedic. This isn't what I signed up for." As pressure mounted from multiple directions, cracks began to appear in the union's united front. Some board members privately expressed concerns about the organization's handling of the case, worried that their aggressive defense of Santana was damaging the union's credibility and undermining public trust in law enforcement. Detective Sarah Williams, a union board member, confronted Castellanos during a closed-door meeting. "Frank, we're losing this fight, and we're destroying our own reputation in the process. Maybe it's time to admit that Santana crossed a line and focus on protecting officers who actually deserve our support." But Castellanos remained committed to his strategy, convinced that any admission of wrongdoing would set a precedent that would make it impossible to defend officers in future cases. "If we throw Santana under the bus, every officer in this city will start wondering whether the union will be there for them when they need us," he argued. The union's intransigence only deepened public anger and reinforced perceptions that law enforcement was more interested in protecting its own than serving the public. Community leaders who had previously maintained cordial relationships with police began calling for fundamental changes to the way officer misconduct was investigated and punished. Reverend Marcus Johnson, a prominent civil rights leader, summed up the growing frustration during a rally supporting Jordan Ellis. "We have a paramedic who risked his life to save someone, and we have a police officer who threatened to kill him for it. The fact that the police union is defending the officer and attacking the paramedic tells us everything we need to know about where their priorities lie." As the week progressed, it became clear that the union's strategy had not only failed to protect Santana, but had actually accelerated demands for police reform and increased public support for Jordan Ellis. The attempt to silence criticism through character assassination had backfired spectacularly, creating a narrative that painted law enforcement as an institution more interested in protecting criminal behavior than serving the public good. The price of the union's silence about Santana's previous misconduct and their decision to defend his actions at Miller's Grocery was turning out to be higher than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a case involving one bad officer was becoming a broader indictment of the systems that had protected him and enabled his behavior for years. Jordan Ellis, meanwhile, continued to focus on his work and his family, letting others fight the political and legal battles, while he returned to the simple mission that had guided him throughout his career, preserving human life and serving his community. But even he was beginning to understand that his decision to save Robert Chen's life had exposed something larger and more troubling than one officer's misconduct. It had revealed the institutional mechanisms that allowed such misconduct to flourish in darkness, protected by a code of silence that valued loyalty over justice. 6 weeks after the incident at Miller's Grocery, Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent Catherine Torres arrived at the police headquarters with a team of civil rights investigators and a mandate from the Department of Justice to determine whether Officer Justin Santana's actions constituted a violation of federal civil rights laws. The FBI's involvement transformed what had been a local scandal into a national case study in police accountability, with implications that would extend far beyond the career of one corrupt officer. Agent Torres had spent 15 years investigating civil rights violations by law enforcement officers, had seen every variation of police misconduct from excessive force to evidence tampering to outright corruption. But the video of Santana threatening to kill Jordan Ellis while the paramedic tried to save Robert Chen's life represented something she had rarely encountered: crystal clear evidence of a police officer prioritizing his own authority over human life, captured in high definition and witnessed by multiple bystanders. This isn't a case where we have to piece together conflicting accounts or interpret ambiguous evidence. Torres explained to her team during their initial briefing, "We have video documentation of a police officer threatening to commit murder to prevent a medical professional from saving someone's life. The question isn't whether a crime was committed, it's whether we can build a case that will result in meaningful consequences." The federal investigation moved with the methodical thoroughness that characterized major civil rights cases. Agent Torres and her team interviewed every witness to the incident, reviewed all police department records related to Santana's employment, and examined the broader patterns of misconduct that had been revealed in the aftermath of the Miller's Grocery confrontation. What they discovered was a police department that had systematically failed to address obvious warning signs about Santana's behavior, supervisors who had ignored complaints and minimized incidents, and a culture of silence that had protected a dangerous officer for years. The FBI's investigation revealed that Santana had been the subject of 17 citizen complaints over his 6-year career, that he had been involved in 8 use-of-force incidents involving black civilians, and that his own colleagues had repeatedly expressed concerns about his conduct to supervisors who had taken no meaningful action. The federal investigation uncovered a disturbing pattern of institutional failure that extended far beyond Santana's individual misconduct. Agent Torres discovered that the police department's Internal Affairs Division had consistently minimized complaints against Santana, reclassifying serious allegations as minor infractions and closing investigations without thorough review. Witness statements had been discounted, video evidence had been lost or deemed inconclusive, and victims had been discouraged from pursuing formal complaints through a combination of intimidation and bureaucratic obstacles. One particularly egregious case involved a 17-year-old black student named Marcus Williams, who had been brutally beaten by Santana during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Williams had suffered a broken orbital bone, a concussion, and multiple contusions, but the department's investigation had concluded that Santana's use of force was justified because Williams had allegedly assumed an aggressive stance. The FBI's review of the case revealed that multiple witnesses had contradicted Santana's account, that Williams had been unarmed and compliant, and that the injuries were consistent with a vicious and unprovoked assault. The federal investigation also revealed the extent to which the police union had actively obstructed accountability measures. Internal union documents obtained through federal subpoenas showed that union leaders had developed specific strategies for defending officers like Santana, including techniques for discrediting witnesses, minimizing complaints, and negotiating settlements that included non-disclosure agreements designed to prevent public scrutiny of misconduct patterns. Union President Frank Castellanos had personally intervened in multiple cases involving Santana, providing legal representation that cost the union over $300,000 in fees and settlements over a 3-year period. The union's own internal communications revealed that leadership was aware of Santana's pattern of racially motivated violence, but viewed him as a warrior who was willing to be aggressive in what they characterized as problem neighborhoods. One particularly damning email from Castellanos to union attorney Patricia Hawkins stated, "Santana may be rough around the edges, but he gets results. The people complaining about him are the same people who want to handcuff police officers and let criminals run wild. We need more officers like Santana, not fewer." The FBI's investigation expanded to include federal prosecutors from the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, who began building a case that would encompass not only Santana's actions at Miller's Grocery, but his entire pattern of civil rights violations over his career. The prosecutors discovered that Santana's misconduct had cost the city over $800,000 in settlements and legal fees, money that could have been used for community programs, officer training, or public safety improvements. Perhaps most damaging was the discovery that Chief Morrison had personally reviewed 3 separate incident reports involving Santana's treatment of black civilians and had concluded that no disciplinary action was warranted. The reports detailed incidents strikingly similar to what had happened to Jordan Ellis, Santana using his authority to intimidate and threaten people who had committed no crimes other than failing to show what he considered appropriate deference to his badge. In one case, Santana had arrested a black father for obstruction of justice when the man had questioned why his teenage son was being searched during a traffic stop for a broken taillight. In another, he had pepper sprayed a black woman who had asked to see his badge number after he had stopped her for suspicious behavior while she was walking in her own neighborhood. In a third incident, he had drawn his weapon on a black postal worker who had been delivering mail in what Santana deemed a high-crime area. The pattern was unmistakable. Santana viewed black civilians as inherent threats to his authority and responded to any perceived challenge with escalating violence. The incident with Jordan Ellis wasn't an aberration. It was the logical culmination of years of unchecked racist aggression that had been enabled by a department more interested in protecting its own than serving the public. 3 months after the FBI began its investigation, federal prosecutors announced that Officer Justin Santana would face charges under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code, the federal civil rights statute that makes it a crime for anyone acting under color of law to willfully deprive another person of their constitutional rights. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 10 years in federal prison, and prosecutors made it clear that they intended to seek the maximum penalty. Mr. Santana used his position as a police officer to threaten the life of a medical professional who was performing emergency care on a shooting victim, announced U.S. Attorney Maria Rodriguez at a press conference announcing the charges. This represents not just a violation of Mr. Ellis's civil rights, but an assault on the fundamental principle that law enforcement officers exist to protect life, not threaten it. The announcement of federal charges against Santana sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. Police unions that had been watching the case as a test of their ability to defend officers from accountability suddenly found themselves confronting the reality that federal prosecutors were willing to pursue serious criminal charges against officers whose misconduct was clearly documented. The charges against Santana included deprivation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors alleged that Santana had engaged in a pattern of behavior designed to intimidate and terrorize black civilians, using his badge and gun as weapons of racial oppression rather than tools of public safety. Santana's trial began 4 months later in federal district court, presided over by Judge Patricia Williams, a former prosecutor known for her no-nonsense approach to civil rights cases. The government's case was straightforward and devastating. They played the viral video of Santana threatening Jordan Ellis, presented testimony from witnesses who had seen the confrontation, and called medical experts who confirmed that Ellis's treatment had been both necessary and appropriate. But the prosecution went beyond the Miller's Grocery incident, presenting evidence of Santana's entire pattern of misconduct. They called Marcus Williams, the teenager who had been beaten during the traffic stop, to testify about his experience. Williams, now 22 and a college graduate, described the lasting trauma of being brutalized by someone who was supposed to protect him. "Officer Santana didn't see me as a person. Williams testified, his voice steady despite the obvious pain of recounting the experience. He saw me as something that needed to be controlled, something that deserved to be hurt. The beating wasn't about law enforcement. It was about sending a message that black people weren't safe anywhere, even during routine interactions with police. The prosecution also called Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a psychologist who specialized in police violence trauma, to testify about the broader impact of Santana's actions on the black community. Dr. Martinez explained how officers like Santana created a climate of fear that affected entire neighborhoods, making people afraid to call police even when they needed help, and contributing to the breakdown of trust between law enforcement and the communities they were supposed to serve. Jordan Ellis's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Speaking in the same calm, professional voice he had used during the incident itself, Jordan described his medical assessment of Robert Chen's condition, his decision to begin immediate treatment, and his refusal to abandon a dying man even when threatened with death. "I took an oath to preserve human life," Jordan told the jury. "That oath doesn't include exceptions for when police officers disagree with my medical decisions. Mr. Chen was dying, and I was the only person on scene with the training and equipment to save him. Walking away would have been tantamount to murder." Under cross-examination, Union attorney Patricia Hawkins attempted to portray Jordan as someone with anti-police bias who had deliberately provoked the confrontation. But Jordan's responses dismantled her arguments with quiet dignity and professional expertise. "Ms. Hawkins, I've worked with police officers for 23 years. Jordan said when questioned about his attitude toward law enforcement. "I've always had excellent relationships with officers who understand that we're on the same team, trying to protect public safety and preserve life. What Officer Santana did wasn't police work, it was something else entirely." Robert Chen also testified, describing his memories of lying on the sidewalk while Jordan worked to save his life, and Santana pointed a gun at the paramedic's head. "I was conscious enough to understand what was happening," Chen said, his voice still carrying the weight of trauma from that night. "I knew that my life depended on Mr. Ellis continuing his treatment, and I knew that Officer Santana was trying to prevent him from saving me. I've never been more terrified in my life, not because I was shot, but because I realized that a police officer would rather see me die than admit he was wrong." The defense team, led by Union attorney Patricia Hawkins, attempted to argue that Santana had been following legitimate police procedures and had reasonable concerns about scene security, but their case was undermined by the testimony of other police officers who contradicted Santana's account and confirmed that his actions were completely outside normal protocols. Sergeant Patricia Valdez, who had intervened to stop the confrontation, provided particularly damaging testimony about Santana's behavior and his complete lack of concern for Robert Chen's medical condition. "Officer Santana showed no interest in the victim's welfare," Valdez testified. "His only concern was asserting his authority over the paramedic, even though doing so would have resulted in the victim's death. I've never seen anything like it in 20 years of police work." The prosecution also called Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the emergency room physician who had treated Robert Chen at the hospital, to testify about the quality of Jordan's field treatment. "Mr. Ellis's intervention was textbook perfect," Dr. Harper told the jury. "His pressure application controlled the bleeding, his IV placement was expertly done, and his decision to transport immediately was exactly the right call. Without his treatment, Mr. Chen would have died before reaching the hospital. There's no question about that." The trial lasted 3 weeks, with prosecutors presenting a comprehensive case that painted Santana as a dangerous officer whose racist attitudes had corrupted his understanding of his role in law enforcement. The evidence included internal police communications, witness testimony from multiple victims, expert analysis of use of force incidents, and the viral video that had first brought Santana's behavior to public attention. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Williams sentenced Santana to 8 years in federal prison, calling his actions a betrayal of everything law enforcement is supposed to represent. "Mr. Santana took an oath to serve and protect the public," Judge Williams said during sentencing. "Instead, he used his badge and his gun to threaten the life of someone who was trying to save another human being. This represents not just a crime, but a fundamental corruption of the principles that should guide all law enforcement officers. Your actions that night weren't police work. They were attempted murder, prevented only by the courage of a paramedic who refused to let you kill someone. Santana's conviction sent ripple effects throughout the law enforcement community and accelerated demands for police reform that had been building since the incident at Miller's Grocery. Police departments across the country began reviewing their policies regarding interaction with emergency medical personnel, implementing new training requirements, and establishing clearer protocols for situations involving both law enforcement and medical professionals. The case also prompted congressional hearings on police accountability and civil rights enforcement. Jordan Ellis was invited to testify before the House Judiciary Committee about his experience and his recommendations for preventing similar incidents in the future. "What happened to me wasn't really about one bad officer," Jordan told the congressional panel. "It was about a system that allowed that officer to continue his pattern of abuse for years without meaningful consequences. Real reform requires changing the culture that protects bad officers instead of protecting the communities they're supposed to serve." Jordan's congressional testimony was broadcast live and watched by millions of people, further cementing his status as a symbol of courage and professional integrity. His recommendations for police reform were incorporated into federal legislation that increased oversight of police departments, provided additional funding for community policing programs, and established new protections for civilians who witnessed or reported police misconduct. 6 months after Santana's conviction, Jordan Ellis received the Presidential Medal of Freedom at a White House ceremony attended by Robert Chen and his family. President Katherine Morrison, speaking before a national television audience, praised Jordan's courage and called his actions a reminder of the best traditions of public service. In a moment of crisis, when faced with a choice between his own safety and his obligation to preserve human life, Jordan Ellis chose courage, the president said. His actions that night saved Robert Chen's life and reminded all of us that true heroism often requires standing up to authority when authority is wrong. The ceremony was attended by medical professionals from across the country, many of whom had been inspired by Jordan's example to speak out about their own experiences with law enforcement interference in medical emergencies. The incident had prompted a national conversation about the relationship between police authority and medical necessity, leading to new protocols designed to ensure that life-saving medical care would never again be compromised by law enforcement power struggles. Robert Chen, who had made a full recovery from his injuries, spoke at the ceremony about the man who had saved his life. "Jordan Ellis risked everything to give me the chance to see my children grow up," Chen said, his voice breaking with emotion. "He stood between me and death, and he refused to move even when someone pointed a gun at his head. That's the definition of heroism." The policy changes that emerged from the case were comprehensive and far-reaching. The Department of Justice issued new guidelines for police departments regarding emergency medical situations, requiring officers to facilitate rather than impede medical care, and establishing clear penalties for interference with emergency medical personnel. The guidelines became a model for police departments nationwide and were eventually incorporated into federal law enforcement training requirements. Police unions across the country were forced to renegotiate contracts that had previously provided broad protection for officer misconduct, with many departments implementing new accountability measures that made it easier to discipline or terminate officers who engaged in civil rights violations. The case had demonstrated that federal prosecutors were willing to pursue serious criminal charges against officers whose misconduct was clearly documented, fundamentally changing the risk-benefit calculation for both officers and the unions that defended them. Perhaps most importantly, the incident prompted a broader cultural shift within law enforcement, with many officers recognizing that their credibility and public support depended on their willingness to hold colleagues accountable for misconduct. The thin blue line mentality that had protected officers like Santana began to give way to a new understanding that protecting bad officers ultimately undermined the legitimacy of all law enforcement. Jordan Ellis returned to his work as a paramedic, continuing to serve the same community where he had become famous for his courage. He received hundreds of letters from medical professionals, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by his example. But Jordan remained focused on the simple mission that had guided him throughout his career, preserving human life and serving others. "I didn't set out to become a symbol or a hero," Jordan said during an interview marking the first anniversary of the incident. "I just did what any paramedic would do. I tried to save someone's life. The fact that a police officer tried to stop me from doing that says more about him than it does about me." Robert Chen made a complete recovery and returned to his job as an accountant. But he never forgot the debt he owed to the paramedic who had refused to let him die. He established the Jordan Ellis Foundation for Emergency Medical Services, which provided scholarships for aspiring paramedics and funding for advanced medical training programs. "Every day I'm alive is because Jordan Ellis was brave enough to do the right thing when it mattered most," Chen said at the foundation's inaugural fundraising dinner. "The least I can do is make sure other people have the same chance to save lives that he gave me." The foundation's work expanded beyond scholarships to include advocacy for better protections for emergency medical personnel, research into improving field treatment protocols, and community education programs designed to help people understand the critical role that paramedics play in preserving life and maintaining public safety. As Jordan accepted his Presidential Medal of Freedom, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from a routine emergency call to the White House. The incident at Miller's Grocery had lasted less than 10 minutes, but its consequences had reverberated for months, changing laws, ending careers, and inspiring a national conversation about courage, authority, and the fundamental purpose of public service. Looking out at the audience that included Robert Chen and his family, fellow paramedics from across the country, and political leaders who had championed police reform, Jordan understood that his moment of decision on a sidewalk outside Miller's Grocery had become something larger than he had ever imagined. It had become a symbol of the possibility that individuals could stand up to institutional power when that power was being used to harm rather than protect. But for Jordan, the most important outcome remained the simplest one. Robert Chen was alive. His children still had their father, and a family had been kept whole because someone had been willing to risk everything to do what was right. That was worth whatever recognition or consequences followed. And it was the legacy that would matter long after the medals and ceremonies were forgotten. If this story resonated with you, share it. Don't let the lessons of courage and accountability be forgotten in the noise of daily life. If you're moved by stories that spark change and call for justice, hit subscribe. We've got plenty more powerful tales of truth and transformation coming your way. Because sometimes it takes one person's courage to remind an entire system that human life is worth more than any badge, any authority, any institution that values power over the people it's supposed to protect. Thank you for following this story to its conclusion. Every share, every comment, every subscription helps ensure that stories of accountability continue to be told when they matter most.